Perhaps, Colin, as we're waiting, there should be another 5 or 6 people joining us, but as we're waiting, is it possible to give us a bit of an update, an insider's update on where COVID-19 is at the moment and what you've seen since our last gathering?
So I think Australia is very well positioned now because we're so well vaccinated. We're amongst the best in the world. And even though a lot of people are still unvaccinated, we're not seeing the surge on the hospitals. So it's not that the hospitals don't have any cases, but they weren't as bad as they were a few weeks back. And I think that just reflects that there's, when you have such a highly vaccinated population, there's less active virus in the community, fewer people get infected. So I think we're in a good position. And fortunately, this Omicron variant doesn't seem to be as nasty as it was first thought. So I think, again, we're pretty lucky in that regard. And if our vaccines are still mostly effective against it, then I don't think we have too much to fear. Of course, there will always be new variants. It's just a matter of time. And they tend to grow in the unvaccinated. So the countries where there's very low vaccination rates will be the breeding grounds for new variants. So it's until we get them vaccinated, we're only temporising the risk.
And Colin, is it safe to assume there's, I think, 21 letters in the Greek alphabet, so we've got a few more variants to go?
I'm sure they'll come up with some interesting it'll be a double alpha, then we'll an alpha
variant
kappa or
A,
something
variant
like
B,
that.
Variant C.
But interesting, when you think of the last pandemic, the Spanish flu, it actually died out after a couple of years. And one of the thoughts is that the virus becomes very infectious but less dangerous, and so the populations get a very high exposure to infection, but it doesn't harm them. And then the virus effectively doesn't have the chance to replicate again, right? Because it's already infected everyone. So it's possible that if you get a new variant that doesn't harm you too much, and a whole lot of people get it, it could actually be the end, the virus itself becoming less dangerous.
That's interesting. The problem is, I think, there's so much hype in the media these days that a lot of people that I talk to are getting quite frustrated. And one thing seems to be for sure, though, I think the average punter is saying, no more lockdowns, please. That seems to be the only consistency in anything that I'm coming across these days.
Yeah. No, I think you're right.
Well,
influenza has hung around for a long time, though, Colin. It seems to be around forever and doesn't look like it's going away anywhere.
It won't. I mean, that particular variant, the Spanish flu, kind of disappeared. But when you think about it, in our country, the flu kills a lot more people than COVID has.
Yes. And
we have influenza vaccines every year, and no one thinks twice about it, right? No one jumps up and says, I'm a passionate anti-flu vaxxer or anti-German measles vaxxer. So it would be with us. It's just maybe it won't be as, the consequences may not be as severe.
Okay. Any more questions in terms of COVID for Colin? No? We're good? Well, hi, Mark. Mark Headley's joined us as well. So we'll make a start. You might have noticed that I've got the Zoom call on record. I spoke to Colin before about his agreement that we can record the session. The reason why we wanted to record the session is because we've had a number of apologies. People at Ramsales, people driving or unable to kind of tune in, and this was a topic of particular interest to a lot of people. I didn't want to publicise that we're recording it because it might not have got the same audience that we've got today. And part of the benefit of these sessions, I think, is the Q&A part. Having somebody of Colin's stature involved with this sort of discussion gives us a unique opportunity, I think, to ask the questions that are really important to us. So I wanted to make sure we still had that facility. But I will make the link available to everybody on the call today, but also those that couldn't unfortunately make it. So Thank you for agreeing to that, Colin. Really appreciate it.
Sure.
Most of you have met Colin on the last session, but for those that haven't, I was going to invite Peter Weaver to just give us a bit of a bio and background.
Sure, thanks, Harry. Yes, look, Colin's a professor of anaesthesia at the University of Melbourne. And the University of Melbourne is probably the largest medical university in Australia. It's quite a prestigious facility. Colin's a passionate teacher and he's also a practitioner. Colin teaches not only anaesthesia, but also has major teaching interest in echocardiography and clinical ultrasound. When Colin's not teaching, he practices a couple of days a week. And one day he actually practices with his brother, Alistair, who is one of the top heart surgeons in Victoria, if not Australia. Colin's a father of two very successful children. And I can vouch for him. He's a very good person. He's an excellent gardener, and he only grows things that he can eat. And you know, some people might say he's an excellent cook, but he's probably more at chef standard rather than cook standard. And I must say, Colin does enjoy the occasional glass of red wine too, Harry. So we're lucky to have him here again today. So thanks, Cole.
Peter,
Thanks, Peter.
Colin, I can't thank you enough for making the time. I know you have to juggle a few things to get to this. I'll get Colin to kind of talk us through, you know, the nuts and bolts of diabetes and the sort of disease that we're dealing with. But I just wanted to start off by talking about the difference between life expectancy and health span. There's two different concepts, and I was reading somewhere the last couple of weeks that over the last 200 years, life expectancy, particularly in the West, has increased by about 2 years on average every decade. And there's a book that was published this year called The 100-Year Life by a guy called Neil Ferguson. And in that book, Neil's suggesting that a child that was born in the last couple of years now has greater than 50% chance of living past 105, which is quite remarkable. And some of the American studies and reports that have come through, particularly an organisation, the CDC, the Centre for Disease Control in the US, has also confirmed that life expectancy has crept up, particularly over the last couple of years. It's had a bit of a plateau about 8 years ago, but it's creeping up year on year. And at the moment, the average life expectancy for a male is 78.7 years, and that is going to increase inordinately according to the research over the next few years. So the good news is that life expectancy is going up, but the concept of health span, which is the number of years that you live in relatively good health, is actually not going up. And in fact, there's about a 13-year gap between life expectancy and health span. So that says to me that you can expect to have ill health in some parts of the latter lifespan that you're enjoying. And a big contributor to that, unfortunately, is this thing called diabetes. And Colin's going to talk to us about the various types and what the symptoms are and some of the cardiovascular impacts and so forth. But in Australia, we now believe there's about 1.2 million people that have been diagnosed with diabetes, and there's about 500,000 that are undiagnosed. And depending on which reports you read, it's estimated there's around about 2 million people that are what they call pre-diabetic, and Colin will explain that as he talks about the subject. Worldwide, there's about 420 million diagnosed diabetics, and there's about 200 million undiagnosed. But the really alarming statistic in my mind, the thing that really grabs my attention, is that the global prevalence of diabetes has increased over 300% across the past 20 years. So it's really at epidemic sort of levels at the moment. And I suspect there are probably a few of us around this meeting today that might be in that pre-diabetic sort of stage. So today is really a bit of a wake-up call, and I'm hoping that if nothing else, when we leave this session in an hour's time, we're going to do, we're all going to take some steps to kind of understand what our risk is and what we can do about it. So, Colin, having just talked about lifespan, life expectancy, and health span, perhaps you can take us through the mechanics of diabetes. What is it? Difference between type 1, type 2, some of the symptoms, some of the disease burden.
Good. Thanks, Harry. So, look, diabetes, firstly, is not just a disease of sugar. It's actually a multi-organ system disease. And that means that the impact of the diabetes can affect multiple organs. So fundamentally, diabetes is diagnosed when your blood sugars are too high. Okay, and that can be from one of two major mechanisms. Either your body is not producing enough insulin from the pancreas, which controls insulin, allows it to be brought into the cells to be used. Okay, if you don't make enough insulin, that's type 1. So it's typically younger people, juveniles, or people who, for example, have had pancreatic injury, or you've suffered some other loss from a malfunctioning pancreas. That's type 1. You need insulin. It's lifelong. It's never going to get better. Okay. Type 2 is where your cells become resistant to insulin. And actually, if you measure insulin levels in type 2 diabetics, they're high. In other words, your pancreas is working overtime, pumping out insulin, but it's not being effective because the receptors on the cells, which the insulin binds to, are resistant. And whether you don't produce enough or you're resistant, the same net effect happens, that you get a rise in your blood sugars. Okay, now, typically type 2 diabetic, which is resistance, is something that occurs later in life. It's the most common. Sitting around the room, if you've got diabetes like I do, you're type 2. Okay, that's the most likely thing. My father was a diabetic at the same age that I became a diabetic. So there's a fair hereditary nature to it. I was also very overweight for many years. So there are a few factors there that probably pushed me into diabetes from pre-diabetes, but the bottom line is there's a fair hereditary nature to it. So what is pre-diabetes? That means you're a yet to be diagnosed diabetic. In other words, you've got a very strong propensity to one day have enough insulin resistance that you will be formally diagnosed as diabetes. And often it's about 5 years from the pre-diabetic state to the diabetic state. So a pre-diabetes, you might find that you have, on occasions, raised sugars if you were to test it. But the long-term marker of too much glucose is normal. So that you say, well, you shouldn't have a high glucose, but overall you look okay. That's kind of the pre-diabetes stage. And so it's often detected when you have an annual test and someone does your blood sugar and it's at 8 and you think, gee, that's high. But you do the HbA1c, which is the long-term control measure, and it's normal. Classic pre-diabetes. And if you then have a stress response, like you undergo surgery, you get very sick, you'll find your sugars will go up. Okay, because stress promotes sugars going up. So, and I'm talking not mental stress, but physical stress. So, for example, we often see these people, they're not diabetics, but they come and have surgery and their sugars are way off. And then a little bit later, guess what? It all settles down again. That's your pre-diabetes. So any questions so far on this difference between the type 1, the type 2, and the pre-diabetes?
If you're pre-diabetic, is it inevitable that you'll become diabetic, Colin?
It's not totally inevitable, particularly if you are stressing out the system with bad lifestyle. For a lot of people, though, it is a progression. It is a progressive disease. What we hope with pre-diabetes, though, is that you can delay it as long as possible. So, you know, where if you kind of have a really bad lifestyle right now and you're pre-diabetic, in a couple of years you might be diabetic. You modify your lifestyle, you modify the way you eat and you exercise, well, it might be 10 years. So it's, and that's totally variable amongst people. Some people, the disease is disease, it progresses, and no matter you do all the right things, you still progress in your diabetes severity. Some people, it's almost like it's kind of sitting there in the background for an awful long time.
Thank you.
I think Alex had a question as well.
Yeah, I was going to say, can you control type 2 diabetes with food, your choice of foods, like more vegetables and more, you know, that type of food?
Yes, so Harry, were you wanting to talk about lifestyle stuff later, or do you want me to address it now?
I'll address it now because we might run out of time. So,
sure. All right. So the first thing is that exercise is the wonder drug for just about everything. All right. So the more regular exercise you have is very important for controlling diabetes, and probably, and we're not 100% sure, but it's pointing in the right direction that resistance training is probably more important than aerobic training. In other words, doing weights in terms of control your diabetes. It certainly seems to be more important for other recovery parameters like brain function and so forth. So exercise, okay. Diet, what's important about diet, and on Harry's email, there's a TED talk, which is really good. I highly encourage you to look at it, because the classic diabetic diet was to have 5 meals a day with a carb load. And it's probably the absolute worst thing you can do. Basically, carbs for diabetics are no good, particularly type 2. You very, very rarely have low sugars, okay, with type 2 diabetes, even if you're on insulin. So when you have carbs, it kind of really stresses the insulin response, and your sugars shoot up, right? And that makes your body secrete more insulin, which makes you hungry, which makes you want to eat more carbs. If you actually look at fat has a very slow glucose increase and makes you feel full, and protein somewhere in the middle. So actually, if you're a diabetic, you want to switch from a carb diet to a low carb diet and increase your fat. And it's counterintuitive, because then you think, oh my God, you know, we have all this fat, it's going to be bad for my heart. Actually, not necessarily so at all. So, you know, less carbs, more protein, more fat is actually the diabetic diet. And I, for example, only eat twice a day. I don't have breakfast. So I do that sort of 16-8 fast. And that actually improves your insulin levels and improves your insulin resistance. So that your intermittent fasting has actually been shown to improve your diabetic control as well as maintaining your weight loss. So I think there's a lot of hearsay about what you should do with your diet, and we're transitioning from the old way of thinking to the new way of thinking.
Colin, can you just give us some more details around your diet? Because that when you wake up, what do you eat? How do you feel?
Yeah. So look, one of the things about symptoms, right, is that particularly for pre-diabetics, you're not going to have any symptoms at all. If you have florid, uncontrolled diabetes and your sugars are really high all the time, you will feel lousy, you will feel fatigued, and you'll pee a lot because the sugar makes you wee. And particularly at night, you're up to 3 times a night needing a wee. But you know, you balance that. And for a lot of people, their sugars aren't totally out of control. But I know when my sugars have been higher, I don't feel that good. And when they're in a better control, I feel a bit better, a bit more energy. But it's very subtle. The trouble with diabetes, uncontrolled, is that it has multi-organ effects. It has effects on the heart, on the blood vessels, on your eyes, on your kidneys. So, you know, people with uncontrolled diabetes, they have strokes, they have heart attacks, they go blind, they get neuropathy of their hands and their legs. They end up with amputations of their toes, okay? And they get kidney failure. So these are the really consequences you do not want as a result of not controlling your diabetes. And it's a bit like hypertension. Now, hypertension has no symptoms until you have a stroke or a heart attack. And then you realize, oh my God, I've had 10 years or 20 years of uncontrolled hypertension. That's the consequence, but you don't feel it at the time. So although, and this is one of the issues of dealing with a lot of chronic health problems, is if you're not acutely feeling bad, there's no feedback loop to say that you're feeling better. You just got to trust that if you don't take control of it, you're going to suffer a consequence a decade down the track, which then may be irreversible. So that's a really important thing to get. In terms of my diet, you know, for my entire life, I've battled weight since I was about 10. And when I got diabetes, that was a super wake-up call that, okay, you've actually got to, and I was probably pre-diabetes, okay, it was going up, and I tried to control the diet, and I lost 10 kilograms, and I tried to improve my diet, and it improved for a bit, and then crept up, okay, the progression. And then one of my friends he was again like me, always battling weight. He tried the 16-8 diet, and he just lost 20 kilograms, boom, in about 6. And I thought, that's bad for diabetes, isn't it? That goes against our teaching. So I Googled it and did some research, and actually it's not. We don't need to have food all the time. We're not built to have food all the time. So I gave it a try, and overall I lost 30 kilograms, and that helped my diabetes. Okay, so my sugars in the morning, I try to keep them under 10. I'd like them to be under 8, actually, and I'm working on it. I can tell you that my sugars are never below 6, even if I haven't eaten and I've had a shot of insulin in the morning by lunchtime. It just doesn't happen. And I can ride my bike into work, you know, an hour and a half on the bike, and I've still got sugars that are not low. So type 2 diabetics have a much lower risk of having hypos, right, which can be dangerous. Type 1 diabetics, much higher risk. That's a fundamental difference. So how you control your weight is probably less important than you control your weight. And for me, my personal mechanism was to go on this intermittent fasting, and that allows me to control my weight. So, okay, I could probably lose a few more kilograms, and that might help a bit. But there's always a balance, right?
I keep on reading about the impact of losing between 5 to 7% of your body mass. What's the magic in that?
Well, I think, you know, if you were of normal weight and height, losing 5 to 7 is probably not good for you. But most of us are the other way, right? So we're kind of a little bit on the pudgy side. And so losing that, it takes the stress off so many parts of your body. And one thing that I think we're becoming better aware of is that actually exists in an inflammatory state. The body is actually inflamed, and inflammation is bad for many things, including diabetes. So I think whether you're reducing the inflammatory effect, whether you're just taking the stress off the cardiovascular system, and you're not having to pump out so much insulin from your pancreas, et cetera, I think what you're doing is really just returning to where you should be. And that is probably what's got that health benefit.
Any questions so far, particularly in terms of diet?
So what do you have for breakfast? You mean you have no breakfast
I
at
don't.
all? Right.
I have a cup of coffee.
So you can ride your bike for an hour and a half into work without having any tucker at all. Wow.
Yep.
Was that a great?
It's interesting. Yeah, look, it was gradual. When I first started, by 10:30, I'd be just ready to, eat anything on the shelf.
Mm.
If there's a cow in the paddock, I'd probably go and put my fangs into it by 10:30.
We can
But you train yourself.
cows if you need it, Colin. We can supply the cattle. I want you to know that.
That's good. But you train yourself, right? So you're given at 10:30 when you're starting yet, and I'd have snacks like nuts, which actually are more high fat rather than carbs, and they're just enough to stop you feeling hungry, and then you'd have your lunch. And in fact, I got to the point where I could some days only eat once a day if I wanted to lose weight. So eating twice a day, I maintain weight. But to lose, I've got to even go harder. And it is a training thing, but you can do it. And then you find this happy balance. Also, some of the diabetic medications can help you with hunger control. So metformin, for example, a very common first-line agent, is an appetite suppressant. Insulin, on the other hand, is an appetite stimulant. So a lot of people who end up on insulin really struggle because they eat more and put on weight. They're kind of counteracted.
So
and there are some of the, yeah.
So do you also find, do you also find by when you get down to 1 meal a day that you start to lose muscle as well?
No, not at all.
Yeah.
No. Now, I wouldn't suggest that you do 1 meal a day unless you're in a period of where you really want to lose weight. Yeah. And it's quite hard. It's a bit of training. 2 meals a day, most people will lose weight. And then you'll get to a point where you'll just maintain it. I wish I'd known this 30 years ago, because it's the single most effective thing I've ever done in my entire life to maintain my weight or to bring it back to a normal range.
So, Colin, one of the things you mentioned was that diabetes, part of that would be getting up several times during the night to go to the bathroom. I've recently been diagnosed with sleep apnea, and all of a sudden I wear a sleep apnea machine. I don't get up to go to the toilet anymore. I haven't changed my diet.
It's interesting, isn't it? Yeah.
But I could be someone that could get up 4 or 5 times, and now I don't get up at all.
That's interesting. I'm not quite sure on the mechanism for that, Mark. Whether you, when you woke up before, whether it's a habit that you'd go and have a small wee, or were you having big wees every time?
I've had prostate cancer, right? So I've had my prostate removed, but the sleep apnea machine is just so I suffer from reflux, and I don't suffer near as much from reflux anymore.
Yeah. There's no question sleep apnea probably is one of those conditions that also puts you in an inflammatory state. And I think,
So you finish.
I was just saying that fixing that probably helps your body reduce inflammation. I'm not sure if that's the exact mechanism.
Physiologically, people don't eat 3 meals a day. That's only a modern thing, isn't it? So we're not actually designed to eat 3 meals a day anyway.
That's right. It's true. And that's probably the basis of why the diet works, is that we're not actually designed to eat 3 times a day. We're certainly not designed to eat 5 times a day like the old diabetic thinking was.
Colin, do you make your main meal your lunch or your dinner?
No, look, main meal probably still is dinner, because that's the social thing. We're sort of still bound by that social norm. And I try to have a relatively low carb lunch. So enough to fill me up, and it's got protein and veggies and stuff like that, as much as possible. The other thing is I'm actually gluten-free, which is in some ways a bonus, because I'm not tempted to have those wonderful cakes or sandwiches or lots of bread things, because I can't tolerate it. But you think your classic lunch, right? It's carb heavy. It's sandwiches, it's a pie, it's something with chips. That's probably that's bad for diabetes. something that's a bit more protein or fat rich with less carbs is better.
I need to mention that there's a time-honoured custom and practice within, not just within AWN, but within our industry, that we always pop into the local bakery when we're making calls. Always. It's like a religion.
Yeah. And, you know, that's something that, well, it's just, if you're a diabetic, you don't do that. Or you go there and have the coffee, but not the cake. Because that's just, it's interesting. Again, I can highly recommend you watch that TED Talk, because they've got a lovely little graph that just shows the glucose spike when you have a carb-rich meal. And that is just forcing your body to pump out as much insulin as it can do. Yeah. The other part of that TED Talk that I found fascinating was the the kind of cycle that pharmaceutical companies have kind of got us into, where you've got to take carbs to make the drugs effective, and then to make the drugs effective, you've got to take more carbs, and it kind of, the way the lady portrays this, it's really almost like unbelievable. Well, I think the other big problem here is just, if you think of the food industry in the last decade, it was all about fat is bad. And so to take fat out of food, to make it palatable, you add sugar. Anything that's 97% fat free, it's just got 10% sugar in it. And sugar is probably the worst thing you love sugar, by the way, including me. We've all got sweet tooths. But it's really bad for you. So we've been conditioned to have a diet that's exceptionally bad for diabetics. And that's perhaps one of the reasons that we've seen such a spike and increase in diabetes is because we had this culture. Now, I think that's starting to turn around. People are saying, well, sugar's bad, fat's not so bad. Which, if you think of the Mediterranean diet, it's probably ideal. Always has been. They have quite a high fat because of the olive oil. And they don't have a lot of carbs.
Oh, and that's why Alex Gangas and I have this, Mediterranean complexion. We kind of glow. We're kind of just naturally healthy. Yes.
And Colin, I think the more salt you add, you can add more sugar, and then you add more salt. That's how a lot of commercial foods are made. And Colin, just on we should all no doubt go to the doctors once a year for a grease and oil change, but is there something that we should be asking our doctors to do to kind of predict diabetes at certain tests, or what do you recommend there?
So in terms of testing, when you have your checkups, your doctor can, if you're a low risk for diabetes, you might do a spike glucose check. Okay. On the day, if it's up, then you might say, okay, we better keep an eye on this. The HbA1c is a test that measures long-term glucose control. And that's a far better predictor of whether you either have diabetes or you're heading that way. And I think too, if you've got a strong family history of diabetes and you're approaching the age your parents got diabetes, that's something worth mentioning to your doctor as well, because that means you're more of you needs to increase. The old glucose tolerance test, that is still done by some people, and that's where you stress the body with a glucose load. You kind of drink a jug of glucose syrup, and then they do serial blood tests for your sugar level. And if you have an abnormal spike that persists longer, they'll be saying, well, you're in that pre-diabetes phase. But, I think when you're getting to that point, you're at the pointy edge and they're working out, have you got diabetes, have you not? Are you diagnosable yet? Your general surveillance, if you've got to have family history, I'd be asking for an HbA1c.
Harry, can I ask a question, please? Colin, fibre in diets, like bran fibres and things like that, which we normally eat at breakfast time, which if you're only eating 2 meals a day, you don't have breakfast. So obviously fibre must be very important in the diet as well.
Fiber is not as important for diabetes as it is for general bowel control.
Mhm.
Okay. Of course, I would be recommending you have fiber, and you have, as I think it might have been you, Peter, said or was it Alex, lots of veggies in your diet, because that's natural fiber too. I think that's good gut health. Now, is there a relationship between good gut health and diabetes? If there is, it's a weak link, hasn't been strongly identified. But overall health, diet control, fiber, it all goes together. So I certainly would advocate that you have a diet that is got plenty of fiber in it. But whether that specifically reduces your risk of diabetes, I don't know.
It's interesting. I was reading some research from Canada a couple of weeks ago now, and it suggested that there's a health benefit, particularly with type 2 diabetes, of consuming, I think, between 400 and 500 grams of dairy products, particularly yogurt, per day. And there seemed to be a number of randomized controlled trials that suggested that was the case. The only kicker for me was that the biggest part of the research was sponsored by the Canadian Dairy Association. So doesn't mean it's not right, but it kind of takes some of the shine off.
Yeah, that's right. Have they got their snout in the trough? Have they, the dairy lot?
I don't know.
Look, I haven't come across that, and my own endocrinologist hasn't discussed that with me about diet. But I'm sure there are lots of things that we still don't know and will be found out, and maybe dairy. Now, whether that's your dairy, you're effectively having more fat in your diet, and therefore you're lowering your insulin spike, that you're substituting carbs for dairy, which is fat and protein.
Yeah,
I'm not sure. That might be a mechanism, but I can't really comment further, Harry.
Okay. There's a couple of things we want to go through this afternoon, but in case we run out of time, I just thought maybe at this juncture we stop for a minute and we'll say, if we were to do something positive next week or the week after, that would help either raise our awareness in terms of diabetes, but also give us some sort of, idea of our risk profile, what would we do?
Okay, so in terms of risk profile, number one is going to be your family history.
Yep.
So if you've got a relative, particularly father, mother, right, who've got diabetes, you're at increased risk. The second is age. So if you're over 50, and there are just one or two people in the audience who are probably over 50 here, not looking at you, Brendan. Well, as you get older, you have an increased risk of type 2 diabetes, right? So it doesn't mean you can't get it younger. But if I look at Ben or I look at Brendan, Ben's much less likely to have it at this stage of his life than Brendan would. And then get on the scales. If you're overweight, again, you're going to greater risk.
BMI?
Well, BMI and weight, right? So if they're related. So obviously, if you've got a BMI over 30, it's good. It's much better to be under 28. A lot of us are probably 32, 33. And that's classified now as quite overweight.
Right.
So if you're kind of that, as you said, 7% over or more, well, one of the things you can do is say, well, let's think about trying to lose some of that weight and start exercising. Have actually do a little diary of how much actual exercise you do in a day. Okay, I know Peter Weaver is probably never going to get diabetes because you can't keep the man still, right? He's always doing something physically, right? He doesn't need to go to the gym. But others might be sitting in an office in front of a computer and then they get in the car and go home. Well, there's almost no exercise.
Yeah. For a lot of our guys that have to travel, their day starts pretty early, up by 6 and on the road by 7. And they drive long distances. They might walk around a paddock or in a wool shed for a bit, but it's not really, cardio, certainly not resistance training. And then they drive back, long drives. They get home 6, 7 o'clock at night. They just don't feel like going for a walk or it's just a long day. So how do we incorporate exercise into that sort of routine, do you think?
It's actually really difficult because when you're particularly driving and sitting, right, you feel unmotivated.
Mm.
So you get at the end of that day and you're knackered, right? You just want to go home, crack a beer out of the fridge, have your dinner, watch some telly, go to bed.
Mm.
All right. So, and that's, we go through our life until we get the wake up call.
Yep.
That's an issue, right? And the wake up call is, doctor says you got diabetes, doctor says you got heart disease, doctor says you got something else, right? Oh my God, the lights of the heavens have opened of realization.
Mm.
And then you're positively motivated to do something about it. So you will get home and you will go for a proper walk, or you'll go to the gym, or you'll do, you'll get up that little bit earlier and do 10 minutes of exercise before you get in the car. Where you can, you'll ride a bike because you're now motivated to do it because you know you've got a health problem. So of course the real challenge is, whilst you're not diagnosed with a health problem, how do you motivate people? How do you self-motivate to say, well, actually, I've got to start at my younger age, or if I'm older now, I've got to get cracking before I get sick to prevent me from getting sick. There's no magic answer other than you have to have self-realization. This is actually what you've got to do if you want to remain healthy. Now, it's a bit like you're talking to old people and wellness, right? At the end of the day, if the old people move, if they exercise, if they get out and do things, they have wellness much longer. You can be an old person still alive and you're frail and you sit in your chair all day. You're not going to do it. You're not going to be well. Yeah.
Yep. Any comments or observations or questions? Anybody feeling nervous?
I think they're all scared, Harry.
Yeah. Scared the shit out of everybody. So, but I think that to me the message is clear. If you haven't had a medical, a long session medical examination with your GP for a while, then hopefully this will be a clarion call to do that. On a couple of mental health first aid courses, we talked about the importance of getting the right GP. If you go to one of these super clinics and you have a speed GP that wants to get you in and out in 5 minutes, that's probably not the right arrangement. Find a GP that's going to take the full 20 minutes to take you through the questions that need to be asked and prescribe the tests that need to be prescribed. Colin mentioned the HbA1c test. A couple of guys that I've spoken to, I forgot who it was now. It might have been wasn't one of the marks I thought said that, but somebody had tried to get a HbA1c test through their local GP, and the GP talked them out of it because I think you've got to pay something for that test. Unless you're diabetic, the Medicare won't cover it, which right. I find bizarre.
Yeah. Look, I'm not sure because being an anaesthetist, I don't actually order HbA1cs typically, or if I do, it's in a hospital. So you could be right there, Harry, that unless you are diagnosed diabetic, but whether your GP can, fudge it and say you're pre-diabetic or something like that. I'm sure there are ways around it.
But even if you had to pay for it, my advice would be pay for the test. It's not going to send you broke, and it will give you, I think, very good data to base some decisions on. And then changing lifestyle, I think, has to be a family thing. You can't do it on your own. You need to be able to make sure that there's a clear understanding in terms of why the changes are necessary, doing that sort of stuff, I think, is a a worthwhile conversation with your partner in that situation.
Harry, also just your mental health on this. Like I know my wife Karen, the gym's been shut in Victoria for some time. As soon as she was able to get back to the gym, her mental health, she actually felt it was improved.
Right.
So exercise is important.
Well, even if from a medical point of view, exercise has been proven now through a number of meta-analyses, which is a conglomeration of randomized controlled trials, to show that for mild depression, exercise is quite therapeutic. It's more therapeutic for older people than it is for younger people, but and less impactful for severe cases of depression. But for mild depression, exercise is a tonic. So again, I think there are, as Colin said, exercise is a fantastic cure for a lot of things.
It is genuinely the new wonder drug is exercise.
Yep.
And the good thing is it doesn't cost anything. So, and I mean, to give an example, we just recently published a paper looking at the effects of resistance training post cardiac surgery. So that you have rehabilitation, and the classic is low-level aerobic, people walking, and they're all discouraged to do much. So the flip side is actually resistance training, not super heavy weights, but lightest weights. It's quite safe to do.
Yep.
And we looked at their brain recovery, because after a huge operation, a lot of people, their brain takes a bit of a hit for a while and then recovers. And we could show a difference at 12 weeks after surgery that people did resistance exercise had a higher rate of brain recovery.
Wow.
From one intervention. So, if it's got that effect in your brain, think of all the organs having some effect on it.
Okay.
So I think it cannot be overemphasized that exercise is just got to be incorporated into our way of life.
I'm just thinking out aloud here. Where AWN seems to be the innovator in the industry. Maybe when we get to driverless Prados, we can have weights in the car. We can do some weight training on the way to course. Not so far-fetched, but thank you for that. There is a case study attached to this, and I would like to spend a few minutes going through that. Has everybody had a chance to look at the case study?
Yep.
Anybody not had a chance to look at it? Okay, let me just read it out to you. It'll take me too long to put it on the chat box, but this is the case study as it's been presented. Your brother-in-law and good mate Shane is a member of the biosecurity team working out of Hunter Branch of New South Wales Local Land Services. For the past 2 years, he's been working on a project focused on reducing the impact of pest animals. From the feedback you've received from wool growers in the region, the program seems to be working quite well. It's reinvigorating and restoring confidence in the local sheep industry after increasing wild dog attacks had threatened its future. Your family normally catches up socially with Shane and his family every 2 to 3 months. These family gatherings are usually a lot of fun and everyone looks forward to them. After a couple of beers, the topic of conversation invariably drifts back to wool, and Shane usually speaks quite passionately about the importance of the work he's doing. 6 months ago, he was bragging how the number of sheep and lambs killed by wild dogs in his group's control areas have halved in the last 2 years. When he gets started, it's pretty hard to shut him up. Although he loves his job, Shane confided in you that he has been quite stressed at work the past year due to COVID cutbacks and office politics. At the last 2 family gatherings, you've noticed a gradual change come over Shane. Last weekend, for instance, Shane seemed totally out of sorts. He was much quieter, bordering on subdued. He was quite moody and emotionally quite brittle. He snapped at one of the kids over something quite trivial. As hard as you tried to engage him on work stuff, he wouldn't be drawn into the conversation. You also noticed he'd gained considerable weight over the past 3 visits and is smoking much, much more. When he spoke with his sister, Karen, who's Shane's wife, you learned that Shane hasn't been sleeping much. He gets up frequently during the night to take a piss, and has taken a lot of sick leave lately, citing back pain, headaches, and a fogginess in his thinking. From previous conversations, you're aware that Shane has had some disturbing feedback from his GP regarding some of his test results when he had his last full physical. In particular, his blood sugar levels seemed very high. Concerned, Karen suggested making some lifestyle changes, but Shane tried to de-escalate the situation by saying that he felt fine and that the blood test result was probably inconclusive. When he had a follow-up blood test, fasting glucose test that is, the results were better, but Karen confided in you that she thinks he gamed the results by watching carefully what he ate the days before he took the second blood test. Karen mentioned that Shane's dad had his left leg amputated and subsequently died at the age of 62 of complications associated with type 2 diabetes. She's worried that he may be headed down the same path and felt that Shane was currently in a state of denial. While Karen's been trying to introduce some healthier dietary choices at home, Shane has continued his predominantly high-carb diet of highly processed food. For example, his daily lunch at his favourite bakery around the corner from his branch routinely includes a Ned Kelly pie with lots of sauce, a Lamington washed down by about 600 mils of Coke Classic. Sometimes when his mates try to guilt him, he'll change to Coke no sugar or 500 mils of flavoured chocolate milk. Although Shane's job involves meeting landowners on farm, his job is actually quite sedentary by nature. Other than coaching his girls' softball team and a bit of golf every now and then, activities that he's increasingly lost interest in pursuing recently, Shane doesn't get much exercise at all. Normally, Shane only drinks on weekends, but Karen commented that he's been drinking much more during the week lately. His drinking has been the source of several arguments between them. She said that after you and your family left their house the last visit, Shane told her that he was fed up with life. You suspect Shane may be displaying signs of depression, but you're not sure. You're also concerned about Shane's physical health and whether he may be headed towards type 2 diabetes. How can you best support Shane? So are you happy if I organise a couple of breakout rooms, spend a couple of minutes discussing this, and let's come back? That's probably the most economic way of getting some views on this. But if you've got the case study there, have a flick through it again. But I think you kind of get the gist of what's going on. So I'll break out now, and I'll call you back in 1, 2, 3, in a couple of minutes. welcome back. What were the salient features of this case study? What are the key points we should identify?
If I could talk about our group.
Yep.
Our group identified three things. Was support for the person, support him, encourage him, and get a third party involved, like a doctor, preferably, for guidance without you doing the guidance or you doing the direction. Be there to support him and encourage him to do the right thing.
Great. Who can add to that? Thank you, Alex.
Big Lucy, from our group, you had some great suggestions. Just to dive you in.
Thanks, Cole. We had a few dot points as well, Alex. We were saying that a good approach, taking some of the mental health first aid training on board for those of us who have done it. The sit-down conversation with someone who's trustworthy. Rick mentioned, not at the pub, not at the family gathering, maybe somewhere that's quieter and less alcohol involved, grab a coffee together. Refer to a GP and have some conversations around what's going on. It's quite, seems like he's in that bit of a cycle between, there's a lot going on perhaps in his health and has the family history of potentially going down a not so great path health-wise, and being able to get on top of that before it becomes a more serious physical and mental health issue.
Excellent. Excellent. Any other comments?
I'll say a few. Mary and Harold and I felt that a lot of what we're hearing was symptoms of a depressive mental state, that he's obviously suffering from stress leading on to depression. So the mental health approach we probably thought was the appropriate way to go, and in that way start to address the mental health side of things, and then we could look at starting to address some of the serious health issues. But the minute you take it too far, and the first thing any bloke will do is dig his heels and say, "Oh, I'm all right, bugger off," and that's what you've got to be very careful. You're treading on eggshells with a guy like this until you can get him to face the reality that he does have an issue, and he's the only one that can really solve his problems.
Excellent work. And as we all know from mental health first aid, the GP is the central locus of control for all of these things. So getting somebody to visit their GP, the GP will obviously attend to the physiological issues that are going on, but they'll also probably recommend that they get put onto a mental health care plan, which will be a referral to a psychologist or psychiatrist or social worker down the track. The literature does seem to suggest a very strong correlation between depression and diabetes. If you've got diabetes, you have a strong propensity to also become depressed, and if you're depressed, there seems to be strong links with diabetes. So this is a really complex case, and you really need to get somebody. You need to get this guy to spend some quality time with his GP and to listen to his GP. So I think you've done well with this. The last thing, I know we're a little bit over time, the last thing I wanted to just do very quickly is just a quick survey to just give me some feedback in terms of how these sessions are kind of resonating with you. So it's just a couple of questions. Just get you to kind of give me a response to that quickly if you can.
Prize?
What was that?
Is there a prize at the end?
There's a mystery shopper incentive. If Colin was the first one to complete, then we would organise a couple of sheep to be delivered to his property. Peter, if you're the first one, then we'll give you a bottle of wine. Thank you for doing this. I think it just gives me a bit of feedback in terms of how we run future sessions, and it's always good to know that we're kind of heading the right direction, if indeed we are.
Harry, I've hit submit and it's not submitting.
Okay.
Just scroll further, Brendan, and answer 3 questions if you haven't done all 3.
Oh, sorry. Okay. Yep. Thank you.
Okay, so we've got 12 of the 16 have responded, so we're 13 now. We're almost there, almost reached threshold.
There we go. There, she's gone now. Yep.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And I think
Thanks, Rick.
there's one that
I don't know what I'd do without you.
Yeah, it got me, Brendan, too, so I'll put my hand up and admit that.
Yeah.
Sorry, say again.
I didn't scroll either and couldn't work out why this system was broken.
You weren't the only one, Brendan.
Okay.
What was that, Ron?
You weren't the only one either, mate.
Okay, so the topic was of interest. Most of you said all of the above. I think most of you said that, if all of you said that you're highly likely to attend these again, and most of you are likely to recommend this to your friends and colleagues. So thank you very much for that. Can I, unless there's any more questions of Colin in particular, and Colin, I can't thank you enough for your time today, and it's such a relevant topic, particularly for somebody that's going through type 2 diabetes at the moment. You can't get a better program host than somebody who's actually living through the condition and has got medical training and can talk about it in such an exquisite way. So I want to thank you.
Thanks, Harry.
On behalf of all of us, and the traditional AWN gift will be delivered, I think, out of hours. Just let us know where to park the truck, and we'll do the rest.
Sounds good.
Thanks very much, Colin.
Pleasure, Harry.
Yeah, well done.
Thank you.
Okay, then. Thank you very much for attending the session, and we'll have some more boosters in the coming year. So I'll probably see most of you before Christmas, but I won't. Have a great festive season and a relaxing break, and get some exercise.
Thanks, Harry. And the same to
Cheers,
everyone.
Harry.
Happy
Thanks,
Christmas.
guys.
Happy New Year.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Harry.
Harry
Have a
and
good weekend,
Colin.
everyone.
All the best. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
See you all.